You know, some places in the world are meant to feel comforting, serene, and peaceful. Soft lighting, hushed tones, the subtle scent of flowers meant to soothe grief. But others, despite their outward appearance, seem to harbor a tension just beneath the surface. Funeral homes are one of those places, a place where life ends, yet strange echoes of what's beyond seem to linger. The quiet can feel heavy, almost oppressive, especially when you're alone in a hallway lined with polished wood. The faint scent of antiseptic and wax mixing in a way that makes the air feel dense. Working in such a place gives you a tolerance for certain kinds of discomfort. You get used to the strange shadows, the muffled noises, and the occasional inexplicable cold spot that passes over you without warning. Yet, no matter how desensitized you become, there are moments that cut through even the strongest composure. Moments that leave a lingering unease you can't shake. I remember the first time I truly felt it. The weight of something unseen in the quiet corridors of a funeral home I had just started working at. It was late. The kind of late where the sun had long disappeared, leaving only the glow of the hallway lights to guide you. The building was otherwise empty. I was cataloging the day's paperwork, a monotonous task that normally allowed my mind to wander freely. And yet, that evening, it felt different. There was a subtle vibration in the air, a faint hum that seemed to move just beyond the edge of perception. I brushed it off, telling myself that my imagination was playing tricks. It was only when I heard the soft echo of footsteps behind me, footsteps that didn't match my own pace or direction, that my stomach dropped. I turned, half expecting to see a coworker, but the hallway was empty, untouched, silent. The eeriness was heightened by the fact that this funeral home was not large. Yet the layout allowed for long stretches of isolation. Wooden floors that creaked softly with every step, high ceilings that seemed to trap sound and twist it into something unfamiliar. Even the rooms themselves held an unsettling stillness, a weight that pressed in. You could almost sense the history of the building, the countless lives that had passed through its doors, and the grief that had saturated the walls over decades. And it was in that stillness, in that heavy silence, that the first story I want to share begins. A story that, even in retrospect, still leaves a chill crawling up my spine. It happened on a quiet morning, the type where the world is just beginning to wake, and the sky holds that pale grey promise of daybreak. I was standing outside near one of the gravesites, a location where families often arrived early to pay respects before the formal service began. Everything seemed normal, peaceful, almost serene. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed a man standing beneath a tree, a short distance away, just far enough to appear out of place. There were no cars, no activity around him, and yet he seemed present, undeniably there. I looked back, adjusting a flower arrangement, only to glance again and find him gone, completely vanished. The cemetery was wide open, 17 gardens spread across the property. There was nowhere to hide, and yet he was gone. A simple disappearance that no one could rationally explain. This was not an isolated incident. Co-workers who spent more time in the cemetery often shared stories of feeling watched, hearing faint voices, or catching glimpses of movement that defied logic. One co-worker had a particularly unsettling experience with a widower. Commissioning a custom granite pedestal for his late wife's urn. For nearly a year, he called obsessively, asking if it had arrived. When the pedestal finally came, they held a private service. Months later, the co-worker awoke at night, heart racing, hearing a voice screaming into her ear, "Bird bath, bird bath, bird bath." The next morning, she came into work pale and shaken. Shortly thereafter, the widower passed away, before anyone could inform them. And then there was the interior chapel, a single space with stained glass windows and rows of chairs, a serene area meant for quiet reflection. Locked each night and reopened in the morning, the chapel should have been empty. Yet one morning, a groundskeeper unlocked the door and found a woman sitting quietly, facing away. He froze. There was only one entrance, and he had unlocked it himself. By the time he and the superintendent returned, she had vanished, leaving only the faint impression of someone having been there. Even seasoned staff began to feel the peculiar energy in the chapel. Tools moved inexplicably. Footsteps echoed when no one was present, and certain rooms seemed to retain a life of their own. Announcing one's presence became a habitual precaution, a mix of respect and self-preservation. Some of the stories were gruesome, not in a supernatural sense, but in the raw, unavoidable reality of death. One particularly haunting case involved a domestic violence victim, a woman attempting to start over, only to be brutally murdered by her ex. Her 3 teenage sons came to make arrangements. Standing outside the room where their mother rested, I gave the usual warning about how death alters appearances. Then, something extraordinary occurred. A sudden drop in temperature, a feeling of dizziness, knees weakening, and an almost irresistible urge to speak, to convey words not from me, but seemingly through me. "She's okay. She's not afraid anymore," I wanted to say, and the unmistakable whisper to the middle child, "Tell him I know. I forgive him." I held back, torn between professional duty and the overwhelming force of what felt undeniably real. Despite years of experience and exposure to the most harrowing realities of death, burned bodies, decomposed remains, tragic suicides, these moments carried a different weight. The cold, the voices, the sense of presence. Perhaps it was the mind's trickery. Perhaps something else entirely. Either way, It left an impression impossible to shake, a reminder that the spaces we consider neutral or mundane can hold layers of mystery beyond comprehension. Even routine removals in the middle of the night brought an unsettling awareness. Motion sensors would flash in sequence, registering movement in locked, empty rooms. Attempts at logical explanations, system glitches, mice, failed to account for the patterns. And so, a subtle but persistent fear would linger, a shadow in the periphery, a whisper in the otherwise silent hallways. By now, working in the funeral home, I had developed a certain rhythm, a way of moving through the quiet corridors with minimal sound, respecting the stillness, and trying not to disturb whatever might be lingering unseen. But even with that practiced caution, some moments seemed to pierce the veneer of normalcy, leaving a lingering sense of vulnerability. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the chapel windows, I experienced one of the most unnerving occurrences in my career. It began innocuously. I was organizing files in the administrative office, the hum of the overhead lights the only sound accompanying my work. The office was separated from the main building by a hallway that stretched into darkness, the polished wood floors reflecting the dim light. Occasionally, a draft would brush past me, subtle but noticeable, carrying with it a faint chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the kind of sensation you notice only when the world seems quiet, when every small detail is amplified. I paused for a moment, letting my gaze drift toward the hallway. And that's when I saw it. A dark figure, standing motionless, just at the edge of the light. At first, I thought it was a co-worker playing a prank, a logical explanation to ease my rapidly rising heartbeat. I called out, expecting a response, but the figure remained silent. My pulse quickened as I slowly approached, each step deliberate, my eyes never leaving the form. Halfway down the hall, it shifted, gliding rather than walking, moving toward the back of the room where the cooling units for caskets were kept. By the time I rounded the corner, it had vanished completely. The door remained locked, the only window barred and cluttered with supplies. Rationally, I knew it was impossible for anyone to be there without detection. Yet the impression of having seen someone or something remained vivid and undeniable. Another story came from a co-worker who had spent years on the grounds tending to the cemetery. He recounted an encounter that had left him pale and shaken. Early one morning, as the fog clung to the headstones like a ghostly veil, he noticed a figure at the far end of the property. Standing under a large oak tree, the figure didn't move, didn't speak, simply existed, seemingly observing him. My co-worker looked away for a moment, attending to a freshly placed flower arrangement, and when he glanced back, the figure had disappeared. Wide open land, 17 gardens. No conceivable place to hide. The disappearance defied explanation, yet the experience remained etched in his memory. Then, there were the instances that blended grief and the uncanny in ways that left an indelible mark. A widower commissioned a custom granite pedestal for his late wife's urn, a piece of craftsmanship that took months to complete. When it finally arrived, a private service was held to inter her remains. Months later, the co-worker responsible for the installation woke abruptly at night, heart racing, hearing a voice screaming, "Bird bath, bird bath, bird bath," directly into her ear. By morning, she looked drained, her skin pale, eyes wide with unease. Soon after, the widower passed away, before anyone could even notify the funeral home. The coincidence, or perhaps something more, haunted the staff. A reminder that the spaces between life and death are often unpredictable and inexplicably intertwined. Inside the chapel, the haunting was subtler, but no less unsettling. The stained glass windows painted colored light across rows of empty chairs, a serene backdrop for services and reflection. Yet objects would shift inexplicably. Tools left neatly on a maintenance cart would appear on the other side of the room. Chairs would be slightly moved, and soft knocks could be heard when no one else was present. Staff began announcing their presence upon entering or leaving, a mix of respect, precaution, and perhaps a desire to avoid drawing attention to themselves from whatever unseen force might be watching. These small rituals, repeated night after night, became part of the rhythm of the building, a silent acknowledgement that it was not entirely empty. Some of the most disturbing experiences, however, involved encounters with the recently deceased in ways that defied professional expectation. One particular incident involved a domestic violence victim who had been brutally murdered. Her teenage sons arrived to make arrangements, a raw mix of grief and shock etched into their young faces. As I guided them into the room where she rested, I offered the usual warning about how death changes appearances, even under the most careful preparation. But that day, something extraordinary occurred. The temperature dropped sharply, a cold that penetrated clothing and skin, and an overwhelming dizziness seized me. I felt an urgent, almost uncontrollable need to speak words that were not my own. "She's okay. She's not afraid anymore," I felt compelled to say, and an unmistakable whisper directed at her middle son. "Tell him I know. I forgive him." Professional boundaries and doubt kept me silent, but the intensity of the sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Working in this environment, one becomes numb to certain things that would shock or horrify others. Burned remains, decomposition, traumatic deaths. All of these become part of the expected landscape of the job. Yet the experiences that defy logic, that suggest a presence lingering beyond the corporeal, leave a profound impression. The feeling of eyes watching, the whisper of voices in empty corridors, the sensation that the building itself holds memory. These are not easily dismissed. And while some might attribute these occurrences to fatigue, imagination, or the mind playing tricks, The consistency and intensity of the experiences across multiple witnesses make them difficult to rationalize. One particularly unsettling night involved a motion sensor system in the funeral home. Cameras installed throughout the building, linked to a central monitor, were triggered repeatedly by movement in locked empty rooms. The green indicator lights flashed in sequence, as if someone or something was moving deliberately from one room to the next. Attempts to explain it logically, a system glitch, a stray animal, failed to account for the patterned nature of the motion. My colleagues, seasoned professionals who had witnessed their share of death and decay, were unsettled. And even I, with years of experience and a certain immunity to the macabre, found myself double-checking corners and doorways as I moved through the building. The combination of the everyday and the extraordinary creates a unique tension. Daily tasks, filing paperwork, tending to flowers, preparing arrangements, are conducted in an environment that is at once ordinary and deeply uncanny. The juxtaposition amplifies the sense of unease, making every shadow, every unexplained sound, every fleeting sensation a potential harbinger of something beyond understanding. In such a place, you learn to respect the unknown, to approach it with caution, and to acknowledge that the quiet may conceal more than it reveals. Even after years in the funeral profession, certain nights would unsettle me in ways nothing else could. There is a rhythm to the work, a repetition that creates a sense of familiarity. Yet some experiences tear through that comfort, leaving only tension and disbelief. One such night, I found myself alone in the main chapel after a late service. The air smelled faintly of wax and roses, the soft hum of fluorescent lights blending with the distant murmur of a ventilation system. I was checking the pews and adjusting the hymn books, ordinary tasks that usually required little thought, when the sensation struck me. A profound, chilling awareness that I was not alone. It began subtly. A faint shuffle, too deliberate to be random, echoed across the wooden floor. I froze, listening intently, trying to locate its source. The sound was neither hurried nor chaotic, but deliberate, measured, almost like someone walking slowly, purposefully, in the dark. I called out, my voice tentative. "Hello?" There was no response, only the faint echo of the shuffle continuing, fading and then returning. My heartbeat quickened, yet curiosity compelled me to investigate further. I moved cautiously, peering into corners and behind the rows of chairs, and yet no one was there. The chapel was locked from the outside, empty, and yet the presence, whatever it was, felt undeniable. Over the years, co-workers shared similar experiences. One groundskeeper recalled early mornings when the mist hung thick over the cemetery, noticing figures standing silently among the graves, only to vanish when approached. Another recounted tools mysteriously rearranged overnight. Objects subtly shifted from their original positions in a pattern that defied logical explanation. Even the most skeptical staff began to acknowledge the strange energy, a quiet tension that permeated the building. You start to notice things you never thought you would. The cold draft that doesn't align with any vent, the faint whisper at the edge of hearing, the feeling of eyes tracking your movements. There was one case that remains particularly vivid. It involved an elderly woman found deceased in her home after several days. When her body was brought to the funeral home, the scent of decomposition was immediate and intense. A mix of ammonia, decay, and something ineffably metallic. Handling such cases is part of the job, yet the preparation of her body left a lasting impression. Even experienced staff who had encountered countless deaths admitted the situation was particularly disturbing. As we moved her from her recliner to the transport cot, fluids spilled onto the carpet in a grotesque display, leaving an imprint that would not soon be forgotten. This is the sort of reality most people hope never to confront. And yet, for those of us in death care, it becomes the backdrop against which the supernatural feels all the more plausible. Amidst the ordinary horrors, there are moments that feel truly uncanny. One of my co-workers, responsible for embalming, swore that the chapel held lingering presences, that energy from the departed remained within the walls. While I had never personally encountered anything overtly supernatural, these anecdotes began to shape my perception. We started noticing patterns, lights flickering inexplicably, faint noises when no one was present, shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. Announcing one's presence when entering or leaving a room became a ritual, a way of acknowledging the space and perhaps respecting whatever energy lingered there. One night, the motion sensor cameras in the building triggered a sequence of events that none of us could explain. Sensors in multiple rooms began flashing in sequence, indicating movement through areas that were completely locked and monitored. Initial assumptions, malfunctioning equipment, stray animals, could not account for the repeated pattern or the timing. The staff involved were visibly shaken. Even seasoned employees, accustomed to the macabre and the unexpected, admitted unease. These occurrences, subtle yet persistent, created an environment where vigilance became instinctual, where even ordinary tasks carried an undercurrent of tension. Then there was the case that tested the limits of my understanding. A domestic violence victim, murdered and brought to the funeral home. Her teenage sons arrived for the arrangements. Grief etched across their faces in raw, almost unbearable detail. As I guided them to her room, I offered the usual advice about the altered appearance of the deceased, but that day, something extraordinary occurred. A sudden drop in temperature, a sensation of dizziness that stole my balance, and an almost irresistible urge to speak words not my own. "She's okay. She's not afraid anymore," I felt compelled to say, and to her middle son, a whisper, Tell him I know. I forgive him. Professional boundaries and the uncertainty of my own perceptions kept me silent, yet the impact was profound. A reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring mysteries that surround death. These experiences are amplified by the contrast between ordinary daily routines and moments of inexplicable phenomena. Handling paperwork, arranging flowers, or preparing for a service is mundane, almost meditative, yet within these familiar tasks, moments arise that defy explanation: a shadow, a cold breeze, a whisper, turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. The juxtaposition heightens tension, drawing attention to the fact that even the most routine environment can become a stage for the uncanny. And while many stories involve subtle, unsettling phenomena, some are undeniably graphic, grounded in the tangible realities of death. Decomposition, trauma, and violent ends are part of the daily landscape in death care. You witness the aftermath of violence, neglect, and tragedy, the corporeal manifestations of suffering. These encounters, while horrific, create a context in which the supernatural feels almost natural, as if the boundary between the living and the departed is thinner than anyone would like to admit. Staff who had spent years in the funeral home began to develop coping mechanisms. Rituals emerged, announcing presence when entering rooms, double-checking locked areas, placing objects deliberately to gauge movement. These habits, repeated over time, became second nature, a mix of superstition and self-preservation. It was understood that the building itself seemed to hold memory, a repository of emotions, grief, and perhaps even remnants of consciousness. This perception created a shared understanding among staff, a quiet acknowledgement that the funeral home was more than a mere building. It was a space alive with echoes of the past. Even with all the preparation and experience, there were nights when the air inside the funeral home felt heavier than usual, as if some unseen weight pressed down on every surface. One of the most unsettling stories came from a colleague who had been working the night shift for several years. He was responsible for monitoring the caskets in the cooling unit, ensuring that each was properly stored and that the environment remained safe. It was a quiet night, typical for that shift, with the only sounds being the hum of refrigeration and the faint creak of settling floors. Then, without warning, the motion sensors in the storage area began to activate, one after another, in a deliberate sequence. Lights flashed on the monitors as if someone was walking from one room to another. Yet the entire area was locked and empty. They checked and rechecked, unable to find any explanation. No intruder, no malfunction, no animal could account for the pattern of movement. The incident left them shaken, a stark reminder that in these spaces, the ordinary and the inexplicable often coexist. Over time, stories like this became common among staff. Subtle experiences that built a cumulative sense of unease, an understanding that the funeral home, while seemingly ordinary, harbored mysteries that defied explanation. Another story, equally unsettling, involved a morning when a co-worker was preparing the chapel for a small service. As she moved through the room, arranging chairs and setting out hymnals, she noticed a figure seated near the stained glass windows, facing away. Startled, she froze, unsure whether it was a family member or someone she had not seen enter. But the chapel had only one door, and it had been unlocked moments earlier with no one else inside. She tried to approach, and when she returned with the superintendent, the figure had vanished, leaving only an empty chair and a lingering sense of presence. This event, repeated with minor variations over time, created a shared narrative among staff. The chapel itself seemed aware, almost sentient, a space that retained echoes of the lives it had touched. The cemetery, too, held its own brand of mystery, wide open, with gardens stretching across the property. It should have been impossible for anyone or anything to remain unseen. Yet co-workers frequently reported feeling watched, seeing figures appear and vanish without explanation. One groundskeeper told of a widower who had ordered a custom granite pedestal for his late wife's urn, and how, months later, a voice seemed to scream from nowhere during the night, "Bird bath! Bird bath! Bird bath!" The next morning, the widower had passed before anyone could notify the funeral home. These incidents, blending grief, loss, and inexplicable phenomena, created an environment in which staff remained perpetually alert, aware that the boundary between life and death could sometimes blur. In the midst of these eerie encounters, there were moments of raw human tragedy that reinforced the weight of the work. One particularly harrowing case involved a domestic violence victim who had been murdered and brought to the funeral home. Her teenage sons arrived for arrangements, grieving, yet forced to confront the altered appearance of their mother. As I guided them into the preparation room, I offered the usual explanation about how death can change appearances. But that day, something extraordinary occurred. A coldness swept the room, a sensation that seemed to drain warmth from the air. I felt an almost irresistible urge to speak words not my own, to communicate a message through me. "She's okay. She's not afraid anymore." And a whisper to the middle son, "Tell him I know. I forgive him." Despite the intensity, I remained silent, respecting boundaries. But the experience left an indelible impression of something beyond explanation. The interplay of the ordinary and extraordinary became a defining feature of life in the funeral home. Filing paperwork, preparing flowers, tending to caskets, mundane tasks that grounded the staff, were juxtaposed with moments of inexplicable phenomena that left the mind questioning reality. Shadows moving at the edge of vision, cold drafts that had no source, tools rearranged overnight, and figures appearing where none should be visible, all contributed to a heightened sense of awareness. This contrast made every night unpredictable, every routine potentially fraught with tension. One particularly vivid incident involved a motion sensor system that recorded inexplicable activity in multiple rooms. Sensors triggered lights in sequence, suggesting deliberate movement through areas that were locked and monitored. Staff members, experienced in dealing with death and decay, were visibly unsettled. Even the most skeptical began to question the boundaries of what was possible within the building. The recurring theme was clear. The funeral home, a place meant for closure and remembrance, held secrets that defied logical explanation. Amid these experiences, there were also moments that blurred the line between professional detachment and personal vulnerability. Encountering the aftermath of violent deaths, handling bodies in various stages of decomposition, and guiding grieving families through traumatic moments created a backdrop where even subtle anomalies were magnified. The combination of human tragedy and unexplained phenomena made the environment intensely emotional, forcing staff to navigate not only the physical aspects of the work, but also its psychological and metaphysical dimensions. Stories of apparitions, sudden cold spots, and inexplicable sounds were often accompanied by equally unsettling sensory experiences. The smell of decay, the metallic tang of blood, the faint creak of floorboards that seemed to respond to unseen footsteps, all created an immersive environment that heightened tension. In this way, the funeral home itself became a character in its own narrative, an ever-present entity that shaped the experiences of those who worked within its walls. Even after years of exposure to death and trauma, some experiences remained unforgettable. One co-worker recounted the moment she noticed a shadowy figure in the chapel during routine cleaning. The figure vanished as she approached, leaving behind only a subtle shift in the air, a feeling of eyes watching from the corner. These encounters, repeated over months and years, created a shared understanding among staff. The building retained memory, energy, and presence, and those who worked there learned to navigate it with caution, respect, and heightened awareness. Even in the quietest corners of the funeral home, where only the faintest hum of lights and the distant shuffle of footsteps break the silence, there lingers an unmistakable sense of presence. Objects shift subtly, shadows linger longer than they should, and the temperature seems to change without cause. It's as if the building itself remembers every life it has touched, every grief it has witnessed, holding these echoes in its walls. For those of us who walk its corridors, who prepare bodies, guide families, and witness the intimate realities of death, there is an unspoken understanding. Some things cannot be explained, cannot be rationalized, and perhaps should not be questioned too closely. The funeral home is more than a place. It is a threshold, a space where the line between the living and the departed becomes fragile. And sometimes, in that fragile space, you can feel them watching, waiting, and perhaps even reaching out.